Hey babe, are you up right now?
Just laying in bed. Kind of lonely today.
Aw, want some company?
Yeah, I'd like that.
Inside an empty rage.
So, right now, you are all of these things.
Inside an empty rage.
All of them.
Inside an empty rage. Inside an empty rage.
Welcome to the first episode of Ditto Nation. I'm delighted to be joined by Shuman Basar, who is I'll let you describe yourself, but I'll describe you as a cultural theorist, curator, general, very interesting person who I've been following the work of since about 2008 when I was studying at the Royal College, and I've kind of been wanting to talk to you since then, which is now 14 years ago, audience, 14 years ago. So I'm delighted to be here with you. How would you describe yourself?
I think people have always heard of futurists, but I think that the level of mystification that we used to ascribe to the future is now something that we actually have to ascribe to the present. It's as though the present is the hardest thing to predict. And so as such, my new kind of definition of maybe what I do is I'm a presentist, trying to make sense of the present, but using all the tools from history and also futurism. And this isn't something new. This is something that somebody like Walter Benjamin, then Marshall McLuhan, and a lot of the great continental theorists, I think what they all attempted to do was sort of excavate the gravity of the present moment. And I think the present is something that has gotten more and more obscured to our understanding, not necessarily our feeling. Those feelings are a kind of occlusion of our ability to understand them. So I think one of the things I've been trying to do for a number of years through books or exhibitions or talks is to try and prize apart that relationship between feeling and understanding.
You wrote an amazing book called The Extreme Self with Hans Ulrich Obrist and Douglas Coupland, which I sent you a picture of myself reading halfway up a mountain in Switzerland.
The Extreme Self is a sequel to The Age of Earthquakes, which came out in 2015. They're similar, they were inspired by this other famous kind of meme book called The Medium is the Massage by Marshall McLuhan, Jerome Agel and Quentin Fiore, which was a sort of quick-fire paperback that also did, I think, an incredible job at distilling very complex ideas about what happened in the electronic age through television, radio, magazines, and advertising, but distilled them in a way that Jerome Agel said, I want this to be understandable to a 10-year-old child. I think one of the reasons I make these books is because my attention span has been shattered. And, the days of sitting down and leisurely reading a novel from beginning to end do feel like the past tense to me. No? There's something, the brain is a muscle. We train it through the feed. And, one of the consequences, therefore, of the kind of feed addiction is that the brain muscle has changed irreparably, arguably. And I sometimes miss the ability to have sustained concentration, because in a way, my concentration is 50 open tabs at the same time, no? And that kind of dopamine, I think it's not enough to only lament it, no? With every loss, we also gain something else. I think we're gaining new senses, we're gaining new abilities. If you just think about how many images we consume every hour, every day, compared to somebody from 30 years ago or 50 years ago, 100 years ago, it's astonishing. And the fact that we somehow don't self-combust, maybe we do, and maybe that's one of the hallmarks of our time, is that we are self-combusting and functioning at the same time. But the fact that we somehow go about our days, we communicate with each other, it's a kind of remarkable thing. Whilst I do miss aspects of my pre-internet brain, I'm also very invested in the present brain and the future brain to come.
Putin may circle Kyiv with tanks, but he'll never gain the hearts and souls of the Iranian people.
Decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of of Ukraine.
One of the reasons I love memes is because I think they show how our idea of literacy has changed. We read images as though they're words, and we read words as though they're images. And somehow there's a kind of bizarre cross-pollination or cross-reading that happens. And the beauty of a really good meme is that it often crystallizes what would take a whole PhD into a kind of half a second of brain processing. That has an interesting neural effect. Normally I would need to spend days reading that PhD from cover to cover to get some really important point about the world or being human today, and I've just got it in 1 second. No? So it's as though I'm often reeling through 100 PhDs a day. There's something about that literacy I'm just really excited about. No?
I love it because I think for me the meme is a sort of focal point of a distillation of a very big decentralized conversation that happens between people. So for example, something that appears on 4chan or appears on Reddit, it doesn't appear in isolation. The context is that that person has been absorbing various things through culture, and that's a moment in time where they crystallize it, and then that goes back into the rest of us. And, it's easy to be, there are bad memes, there are definitely bad memes, but I think that, it's not, for me, it's not the profundity of what they say, it's the fact that they perfectly snapshot some moment in culture, which is very hard. As you said, it would take a lot of academic writing to do that. And I inherently have more respect for something that can be said very quickly and be profound. You can kill things by being overcritical as well. Do you know what I mean? You can kill things by thinking about them too much, but the meme has proved very resilient to that. How long ago were lolcats? Probably, I don't know, lolcats were probably, more than a decade ago, and in that time they've just gone from strength to strength. However, I can see that there's a sort of lull in meme culture, and I wonder where it's going to go next. That's the thing that interests me is, it got to a very interesting point. If you look at older memes, they were bad. It's got to a very interesting, very clever point. Will they go from strength to strength, or will they self-destruct? I don't know. That's what's coming next.
There was a great poet called Czesław Miłosz. Hans-Holger Obrist interviewed him once, and Miłosz said poetry was the least commodifiable art. There are very, very few really wealthy poets who became rich through their poetry, If they're rich, they probably were rich, or they married rich or something. It's very hard to become rich as a poet, no? And because of that, poetry retains a certain kind of function through its non-commodifiability. I think there's something similar about meme culture, no? Like, it'd be great if memers can get rich off it. Probably won't. We're at a point where there is now technology that can monetize absolutely every aspect, of both our waking and non-waking life. Every utterance, every glance, every subconscious thought could be tokenized, could be sold, can be exchanged. I hate the word radical because I think it's one of those words that's almost lost all meaning, again, by being so sort of mainstreamed. But being deterministic about doing things that can't be commodified today does feel like one of maybe the few outposts of being radical. One of the things I always think about when I think about you is your commitment to constantly produce and to share your obsessions and your fascinations. And from what I can tell, you're also not primarily doing this to get rich off it. You're doing it because you have to do it. I think you do it because you love doing it. And you also, I think, love the people that you do it for. But I've always wanted to ask you, what drives you to do the incredible amount of things that you do all the time? And it is worth pointing out that it's easy to be hyperactive for a short period of time. It is very hard to be hyper-productive and hyperactive over a long, sustained period. So what makes you do it all?
Well, good question. I think there are two things. There is a blissful feeling that comes with shitposting, and I think there's a feeling that comes with putting things out, for me, that comes with putting things out onto the internet and then kind of imagining how it's going to be received. And when I'm really the perfect feeling for me, the most blissful feeling, is putting things out there uncensored and then having some kind of feedback mechanism. And there's that feeling of creating an emotion in somebody else. You know, am I making this person feel good and then disturbed and then creeped out and then amused and then a bit sexy? You know, that's a lovely feeling. It just feels like riding this blissful wave of culture, which is not really possible in any other way. With print media, which is how I used to work, you have to commit to something, and it's a period of weeks or months until you see it actually happen. You know, it's a similar thing. You know, I used to print self-published magazines, and you'd put something in there and then you'd put it out, but the feedback loop was much longer. You know, a month till it comes back to the printer. Maybe you'll hear some feedback from the audience in a month if they write a letter to the letters page. This is like you distill that into seconds, and it feels amazing. You know, the best feeling I ever got from a magazine was, this is 15 years ago, was a kid from Wales writing to the letters page saying, you know, I live for this magazine. And I was like, you know, I'm imagining this kid in the Brecon Beacons kind of reading this thing. And now we can have that all the time, you know, somebody in Shanghai or somebody in Australia or somebody in Peru or whatever is enjoying the same thing that I am at the same time, and it feels amazing. So I think that, you know, we can be cynical about the internet. Also, what you were saying about memers doing it for love, I think a less generous reading of that would be that it's for the anonymous clout that has. Sometimes I ask younger people, what would you be more impressed with, a millionaire or somebody with 1 million followers? I don't think anyone cares about money that much anymore, apart from what you can do with it. People are much more impressed with clout. And I think that if you can get clout even anonymously from a meme, that has a more powerful feeling than making money. You know, the crypto boom came along and challenged that. But I still think that people get a more powerful feeling from having reached many people than they do from having acquired lots of material possessions at this point in time.
But isn't clout one synonym for love, or being loved, or being seen, being affirmed, being cared for even?
Desired,
yeah.
It's interesting, everything that you say in a very positive light, I can think of a kind of negative corollary to that. So it's, you know, it's to be desired, to be envied, to be wanted. I think it depends where you're sitting. If you're sitting on 4chan, you're probably on the negative side of that, and if you're on Reddit, maybe a slightly more positive side of it. But I think they're all the same thing ultimately, you know. Wanting to be desired, wanting to be heard even. I think wanting to be heard is a very human thing. And now we can measure that with metrics. You know, what you were saying about tokenization, the other side of that is algorithmic control. You know, you were talking about tokenizing every movement. TikTok is monetizing every movement through surveillance. You know, surveillance technology, you know, the way that your finger moves across the screen, the way that your eyes move, and how long you spend reading something or watching something. All of these things are infinitesimally commodified, and they're valuable. You know, they're valuable to someone, which is fascinating.
I was thinking about this, and it seems to me it's something about scale and simultaneity. You know, you were talking about how you put something out and somebody in Adelaide and Buenos Aires and Arizona could respond to that at the same time. And how, you know, with print, for example, that would have been impossible, no? Because the postage, customs, who's going to stock it, you know, all of those things would have meant that the vectors to each of those eyeballs or those sort of receptors would have been radically different and probably not even exist, you know, for many places on the planet. It seems to be one of the rituals that we participate in now, which is addictive, and I don't think this is a bad addiction, to be honest, is there's essentially a kind of engineering now to create something like a collective synchronized hallucination. And that seems to me to be, again, one of the hallmarks of how things have shifted from community to crowdsourcing to sort of hive mind. It's that sense of simultaneously experiencing things, often with a multitude of people that you neither know, nor you know even necessarily exist, but they're out there. And the tangibility of something that's so intangible is incredibly compelling, no? It's incredibly gratifying as well. I mean, you have so many people that follow you, that you interact with every day, and presumably now that we're out in the world and we're meeting, What's that experience for you, meeting people that you've so far, primarily interacted online?
I love that conversation about firstly, I wanted to say, viewers, this is competition time. If you can think of a good compound word for this, I'm thinking it's kind of a parasocial inversion. Yeah. Do you mean we're all parasocial, and the moment where you meet somebody in real life, that it becomes social. Yeah. So. In my experience, the most horrifying times that has happened has been meeting influencers, people who are extremely good at manufacturing a persona, a very highly aestheticized persona. That can be a real shock. They're maybe, you're imagining them to be tall and they're tiny or whatever it is. They have as you said, a side profile that you've never seen. That's fascinating. In general, I think that we become very adept at reading people from very minuscule signals. Mm-hmm. So in the last, especially 10 years, probably turbocharged by dating apps and by instant messaging and by trial and error, I think that we can read each other's characters from very few words. Mm-hmm. And so when I meet somebody like yourself, or I just met MoMA PS5, who's an account who I've been speaking to them for years now. It's not a big surprise. It's rarely I'm rarely shocked. I rarely think, you're nothing like what I expected, or you're much more horrible, or much nicer, It's normally, I think we've all had to have a very rapid learning experience with that, and we become if you read chat room posts from 15 years ago, people were incredibly naive, exceptionally, and the way that they didn't give each other the benefit of the doubt. There was very little empathy going on, and they just saw each other as words on a screen. And now I think that people have become adept at empathizing with the person behind the words in a way that, has only evolved very recently. So, yeah, I think it's the days of saying, we met each other on Instagram. It doesn't need to be such a strange thing anymore, because how else are we going to meet, at a social function? Whatever that means. No. So I wanted to ask you about, the first thing I ever read of yours was, as I said, it was an essay about data layers in Gaza, created by the IDF and the Israeli state to, survey Palestinians. And I thought there was something about it it was beautifully written, but there was something about it sat on this kind of, I'm not going to say the intersection of art and technology, but it sat on this kind of intersection of of critique of conflict and the fine art world. At the time I was researching relational aesthetics, and this was adjacent to that. But there's a feeling that essay had, and that Benjamin Noy's Drone Metaphysics has, and that Haroon Farocki had. It's when I say aestheticization of conflict, I don't mean that in a negative way, but I just wondered what your thoughts are on that and how you sit within it.
Yeah, no, I think we obviously have to remind ourselves that war and conflict are one of the kind of core topics of art and culture. Some of the great paintings were battle paintings. The subjects of portraiture were the great and the good, who were considered the great and the good, often high-ranking military people. And so I think there's always been an intimate relationship between art and war, because one of the things that art does is glorify things, and it also tells particular stories about history. It frames things, and it importantly shapes the past as the future kind of comes on board. So that's the first thing I would say. The second is, and I was thinking about this, Paul Virilio, wrote many books around this topic, but one of them is called War and Cinema. And he says that there was an intimate relationship between the machinery of war and the camera. He called it a fatal interdependence. So often on tanks, very early, even in World War I, there was a camera at the front there. There is an intimate technological relationship, I think, between war and culture. And the other thing that war is a kind of factory of information. It's spewing out information, but also importantly, disinformation. And I think information is always aestheticized. If we think about one of the latest incursions of the Israelis into Gaza last year, one of the things that we saw were often female members of the Israeli Defense Force taking to TikTok and, doing their own versions of like a TikTok dance or sort of the confessional, overly emotive, direct-to-camera, look how human we are. There was something newly jarring about that. Wars are not only won by sheer kind of brute strength, they're won through the information battlefield. And the aestheticization of information is fundamental to succeeding at conflict, right? Bush would have called it, hearts and minds. No? We think of soft power versus hard power. I think the aestheticization of war and conflict is another expression of how power has to work in order to persuade. I mean, the court of public opinion has been around for a very long time. The birth of the newspaper, I think, was quite instrumental in this. We are constantly making judgments, moral judgments, about everything, every second. No? I was glued to the Amber Heard Johnny Depp trial. It was very amusing, it was full of lols, but I think it was also an incredible sort of demonstration of where humanity is today, where our moral boundaries have been drawn, erased, and redrawn and erased on a daily basis. And so I think given that, it's a sort of Alain Badiou term, this like notion of the event. Everything is an event today, and every event will be perceived and will be judged. Therefore, the information has to do the work of persuading that my version of reality is the version that you should, believe and you should get behind. Aestheticizing that information is a fundamental way in which that information has the power of persuasion. It's not enough to just dump information out there. That information has to be produced, post-produced, aestheticized, be made seductive in order for it to have any power.
When you talk about information, I'm kind of astute, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that you're talking about reported facts. Do you see what I mean? That kind of information. There's another layer of information which is data, and things like open source intelligence have become, they're in the zeitgeist. It's cool to be an OSINT practitioner, whatever it is. But then there's things like signals intelligence and GeoInt and all these other forms of data that they very much form the truth that are also being aestheticized. So things like, people are looking at flight trackers and they're looking at shipping trackers and they're looking at signals intelligence and drawing their own conclusions and using those to bolster the truth and the narratives that they're talking about. Could you have imagined 20 years ago that quite boring signals intelligence would be a trendy thing to do on Discord? Could you have even imagined Discord? But I find that level of it really interesting as well. It's not just the facts and the reported truths, it's also the sort of underlying data layers. Donna Haraway was talking about, there was a documentary about the Cyborg Manifesto that was filmed many years afterwards, and she talks about the left being kind of entranced by the sort of beauty of their own writing, and it was a derogatory thing she was saying, which is that people can be kind of blinded by the beauty of critical theory on the left especially. And I think that whenever, I'm not speaking about your work, but I think there's something about writing about conflict philosophy that for me is so sort of entrancing that I can forget what it's about. Do you know what I mean? And like it's to what end? That's where it sits on the line between art and conflict theory. Do you know what I mean? And I'm not saying that it's necessarily a good or a bad thing, but for me it gives me a feeling that art gives me. That's why I think that forensic architecture is so interesting, and why your work is so interesting is because I consider it art because it gives me a feeling that art gives me. But it's about very serious things. And I wonder, what are your feelings about that? Is there anything problematic in there for you, or is it deliberate, or do you enjoy it? Or?
Well, I had the privilege of being in the first cohort of forensic architecture back in 2005, before it was even had the name. And Eyal Weizman, who convened this new program at Goldsmiths, he had an incredible free hand to invite whoever he wanted to invite, and he ultimately invited roughly about 15 of the most interesting people to him. And it was a fascinating group because they were You know, there were philosophers, but there were also filmmakers, there were self-professed Marxists, there were artists, there were curators, there were writers, there were historians. An abuse of human rights or a sort of calamity or a catastrophe, a genocide and an assassination, you know, an act of, let's say, coordinated violence is an extremely complex event. And, you know, it's a complex event of information, of disinformation, of data, but it's also a complex event that involves the movement of air and how air creates certain kinds of sounds and how those sounds are heard and misheard, etc., etc. So, you know, we're all familiar through procedural cop shows around the fascination that people have with forensics. So if you think about architecture, you know, it's the art of building. You know, it's the art of, and in order to build something, you have to construct something. So, you know, the first brick goes down, the second brick goes up, etc., etc. So you'll go from something that's empty to something that's like complete or full. Maybe you'll create an enclosure, etc., etc. I think one of the really interesting things that came up in our early conversations in this group was looking at the opposite of that, which is destruction. That actually, you know, often the things that are really targeted in war are our buildings, our infrastructure, our bridges. There was an amazing essay by one of the group, Sergeant Jovanovic, and he wrote an essay called Milosevic as Architect. And it was a study of the assault during the Bosnian-Serbian War on bridges and buildings. And it could only have happened through an architectural understanding, you know? So there's a way in which you can think about architecture as an attack on architecture. What is important about the work that forensic architecture do, it's almost like a Chris Nolan move, where they start with the fatal event and they go back in time to ascertain all the various complexities of the situation that would have led up to. I mean, famously, people talk about this with the assassination of JF Kennedy, for example, no? If you think of the thousands of hours of cinema and television and documentary that has gone in, you know, what happened, no, leading up to that sort of moment. But what if, in order to understand the fatal moment, you have to understand exactly how that building collapsed? The reason that forensic architects are able to do this is because it's a collaborative effort, and they often work with artists, you know? And they'll work with filmmakers and video makers, and each of these people or practices bring a different understanding of how space and time and event relate to each other. You know, if we want to call it an aestheticization of war, for me, that is the best reason, no? Because it's ultimately trying to get at a kind of forensic truth that can only be revealed through the collaboration of these different disciplines, one of which is art. The worst example, and I'm not putting forensic architecture in this category, but would be war porn, right? And it's funny because I was just at Documenta this weekend, and there is, you know, an inordinate amount of work there about, you know, genocides, about really horrific acts from history. And then I was thinking about this book by Susan Sontag. It was actually the last book that she wrote before she died, and it's called Regarding the Pain of Others. And one way is you can read this actually as her having almost changing her mind from a very famous previous book called On Photography. You should only take an image of suffering if that process of taking the image can produce an effect or a positive effect, no, on the situation that you're taking an image of. And if you can't do that, you don't have the right necessarily to take the image, no? And even the word, you know, to take an image, I mean, back in with the birth of photography, there was this idea, no, that every time somebody took a photograph of you, a small part of your soul was taken. I don't want to go that far, but I do think that we do need to think more about images.
Давай, родной.
Dom, are you getting rude to man?
That's what you get, fam. Push you. Yeah, blood. Whose end you coming to now, fam? Dickhead.
And I actually wanted to ask you about images because there's this great phrase, it's from the original Assassins, the Hashashin. Nothing is real, everything is permitted. And that feels like a pretty good tagline for today, no? Nothing is real, everything is permitted. Nothing is real and everything can be photographed. Everything can be turned into an image. Everything can be memed. It can be there for our edification, our appetite, and then it's gone. How much do images have power today, do you think, compared to 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago? You know, the very famous photograph, no, of the young girl in Vietnam, the napalm attack. For those of us of a certain generation, we often think about history, often think about events that we weren't necessarily present at through the very specific images. I wonder if that's still the case now.
My inclination is that it's still exactly the same, but there's just far more of it and we're having to choose. I think, you know, at the time of that image was taken, there would have been a lot of other photographs around being consumed, and it definitely has, you know, it had considerable power. So it's not that it existed in isolation at the time. It's much more rare for one image to form an opinion about a conflict, but it's not unheard of. You know, I think there will be some very powerful images that have come from, you know, that come from Gaza or that come from the current war in Ukraine or wherever, which will change people's minds, but they're just competing on a much higher level with far more imagery. And I think that my personal view of imagery is quite different. I'm a bit more of a kind of K-hole view of the image in that, you know, if you think of the postcard of Ling Chi, the death by 1,000 cuts that George Bataille said he kept in his office, and the lineage of that from that Daesh photographs and films, and from that to cartel videos, you know, I think that those images do serve something, but it's something far more nihilistic. I am very interested in that. I don't believe in the worthiness of an image. And you know, there was a time when I was I was in a road traffic accident. I was lying there with my leg snapped in half, and there were people standing around me filming. And I was in extreme pain, audience. I was in extreme pain, but I just thought, fair enough, you know, you reap what you sow. Free content. Have my free content. You reap what you sow. And I didn't begrudge them at all, because I thought, you know, I am the spectacle in this moment, and I would probably do the same thing, or I would at least be observing. You know, I'd definitely be watching. I think I find there's something to be inherently human about wanting to document and observe. And I don't personally think that it has to be for any greater good other than observation. Do you know what I mean? There doesn't have to be anything else about it. This is something that you might not normally see. How does it make you feel? It doesn't need to have any moral justification beyond that for me. However, it's contentious. I think it's important though that we're honest about these things. You know what I mean? I now have to hashtag any gore that I post on Instagram with hashtag medical education, for the pure reason that if I do that, it won't get deleted. I don't need to educate you medically. I'm not a doctor. You know, I'm not out to educate anyone at all. And occasionally I'll get people saying things in the comment section like, you know, I really love these. I get so educated by these posts. It's like, well, I'm glad, I'm happy for you, but that's not the type of education that I'm hoping this will be. Do you see what I mean? It's more about your own perception of the viscerality of existence or violence or whatever. That's the kind of education that I'm really interested in, rather than you finding out how a face transplant works, you know. This comes down to individual moral codes, and I'd say to Susan Sontag, yeah, that's fine to have that opinion, but who's going to police it? You know, who's going to be out there saying you should or shouldn't take photos for whatever reason? I think it's a kind of it's after the fact to say, you know, this is a just image or this is an unjust image, or this image was produced morally or immorally. Some of this kind of feeds into work by some photographers like Corinne Day and Nan Goldin and people like that, where they're controversial, you know, photographing people in mentally unstable states. I think I'm glad that those images exist. Was it morally correct to take them? Maybe not, but I'm happy that they're in the world. And that's something that's very difficult. It's a circle that's hard to square. You can't have one without the other. You can't have documents of... It's probably a good thing that there's a documentation of cartel behavior. It's probably a good thing that we could see what ISIS were doing, what Daesh were doing. But I wouldn't have approved of them doing it in advance. Do you see what I mean?
Without a doubt, the good is that we get to see and hear unedited the sort of innards of everybody who chooses to say anything. And that has produced, I think, a new kind of originality, a new weirdness, eccentricity that, you know, traditional gatekeepers have just absolutely never have sanctioned, right? The downside of it, to me, again, and this is, I'm giving my generational age away, is that it gives the illusion that all opinions have equal relevance and authority. We're now living through consequences of concerted effort to exterminate experts. You know, when it comes to certain health crises or the ecological crises, that I'm still there for the experts. No, like I'm still there for the people. I mean, to go back to, this is to undo what we said earlier, that, you know, the people that have done the multiple PhDs on viruses or on how carbon, you know, affects the air. Your expertise as a soccer mom in Florida, just because you have that opinion doesn't automatically make it the same level of value, no, at a social and political level.
I think that people have been put off experts for the same reason that they've been put off hierarchical media production, in that sometimes those people are wrong, or sometimes they don't have your best interests at heart, and that leaves people lost and confused. And then it's like, well, maybe we just go to this, you know, highly Darwinistic environment, and whoever sounds most plausible could be right. You know? And I think that the downfall of expertise has been an inability to say we don't know. You know, it's very rare to hear experts say we just don't know. And I think this is the thing that bugs me about mental health, especially the way that the mind works and the way that, you know, the complexities of life, is that there's an awful lot of things we just don't know. And everybody would be much happier if people said that. But I think that the fear of the unknown is completely unbearable for people, especially people in academia. It's a double-edged sword, because leaving the door open saying we don't know invites in people who claim to know, but then saying that you do know something which you don't, especially when it comes to the way that the mind works, leaves you open to criticism, because you're wrong. You know, you are wrong. Psychiatrists are wrong. I'll say that really clearly. In terms of, you know, people as media production units, I think, as with everything we're talking about, there's a cynical downside to it and there's a positive upside. You know, I choose to consume a couple of hours of just being on the receiving end of content every day. Would I rather it was a Netflix series, or would I rather it was people around the world showing me glimpses into the way they think in their lives? It doesn't really make any difference. You know, actually, I'm fine with both, and I get to choose now, whereas before I didn't get to choose. So I'm not so skeptical about it. I'm trying to understand TikTok at the moment. I was one of those boomers who was like, I'm never going to use TikTok because the CCP are going to get my data. But now I've given up and letting myself be carried by their algorithm, which is an interesting experience. A lot of it's just dreadful, but some of it is fascinating. I think we've run out of images. I think we've done images, you know, through successively Tumblr, VK, Instagram, Reddit, whatever else, and now we're onto film. You know, and I can see my viewing habits being changed by tech companies. You know, I'm less interested in the still image, more interested in film. And a friend of mine said, you'll love the schizo memes on TikTok. And she sent me a few, and I was like, these aren't memes, these are films. But it comes back to what you were saying, you know, the image and text is now becoming the film and text. Yeah. You know, what's going to happen after that, I think, will be something like a data layer in AR, or, you know, whatever's coming next with the metaverse. We are already moving beyond the still image and text combination into something else. I'm kind of happy to just be along for the ride with all of this stuff to a degree. It's good to have an opinion about it, but I think that believing that any individual can change it is, including Mark Zuckerberg, is delusional. You know, he's being guided as well by this mass psychosis that we're all suffering from or enjoying or whatever.
I wanted to ask you about fiction.
Yeah.
Definitely one of my sort of favorite topics. I think over the last 2.5 years, we have, again, collectively lived through some of the most outrageous real-life narratives that if you had written down and put into a bunch of books or pitched as TV shows, you would have been laughed out of the room. One of the effects, therefore, it has shown up the false distinction that we would now have between fiction and non-fiction, surely, no? But yeah, I'm curious how you feel about sort of the idea of fiction today. Because, you know, bookshops still organize their books, and a literary agent would still think of a proposal as fiction and non-fiction. And now we've had, I mean, countless genres and subgenres, the latest of which has been something like autofiction, which actively welcomes the idea of the narrator that is not, you're not telling the truth, or, you know, all of this kind of stuff, none of which is new. Do you think fiction as a cultural category still has purchase today.
I think that line in the sand is fascinating still, you know, the fiction, non-fiction, very clear, but, you know, binary there. I think that it only serves a marketing purpose within the publishing community, and I think that outside of that, when we're online, we're never thinking about fiction and non-fiction. You know, that purely exists in the world for me of documentary versus, you know, fiction cinema, or, you know, a fiction and non-fiction book. As soon as I'm online, that disappears, and that permeates into my perception of world events. Russian narratives, NATO narratives, you know, those fiction or non-fiction, it doesn't really matter. It's whoever's most plausible. It's interesting to think about asking a machine learning algorithm to write a fiction book. That's coming very soon, but then asking it to write a non-fiction book as well. Does that become, you know, how can you tell? Does it matter if it has the appearance of a documentary style autobiography or biography, but it's entirely fallacious? Does that matter? Because actually the reasons why I'd read a biography are nothing to do with it having to be true. It's about the inspirational effect that it will have on me, or the lessons that I can learn. So I don't think it matters anywhere outside of those traditional binary media formats. Do you see what I mean? It's not something I ever concern myself with on 4chan. You know what I mean?
Hallelujah, my plug just sent me 50, I got burst right of refusal. My bitch is my main shooter, I might make my bitch go do you. Don't bring your bitch around my chick, my bitch might
Slob on my knob, like corn on the cob. Check in with me and do your job. Lay on the bed and give me head. Don't have to ask, don't have to beg. Juicy is my name, sex is my game. Let's call the...
Just to close, I mean, this has been an amazing conversation. I'm so grateful for having it with you. I wanted to ask about the self. You know, I think about, for me, we perceive the barrier of the self to be the skin. You know, this is where my self ends with my skin, or does it? And I just wondered what your thoughts were on that, and what's the future of the self?
I mean, increasingly, I mean, this may sound ironic given that we did a book called The Extreme Self, but I think the self is like time in that they are essentially fictions, but they're necessary fictions. Like, they're fictions that we have to invent and we have to believe exist in order for everything else to work. It's like if you take those things away, the rest of reality just sort of literally collapses. I have a wonderful friend in Dubai who's like, time doesn't exist, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, no, I understand that, you know, from a Buddhist or whatever sort of perspective, but if I really took that seriously, I wouldn't know to turn up here at the right time with you. I might have turned up in 12 hours later, or never, or in 100 years' time. And I think there's something similar about the self. Baudrillard had this concept that, you know, there are certain objects that actually the closer and closer that you get to them, the less you see them, the less that you understand them. I think the self is a little bit like that as well. It's part of our kind of, big word here, but like epistemological, I mean, basically like our understanding scaffolding that we need in order to basically do anything. It is also a fantastically successful marketing term. I mean, what would capitalism be without the individual? It's intimately connected, no? And arguably, again, very, very crude for all you political scientists out there, you're going to hate this, but, you know, socialism or communism prioritizes something like the collective, the state, the people, the community even, you know, over the individual, no? The other end of the spectrum is this, I mean, Ayn Rand and the whole theory of objectivism is the good society, the good state can only come if I am, you know, my happiness and my needs are sort of dealt with. So I think there's a way in which the self is this like fiction that we rely on in order to make things kind of happen. Whether it ends with our, you know, the envelope of our skin, I think that's clearly now a very nostalgic idea, isn't it? You know, if you opened 100 TikTok accounts, each one of those has the potential to be a self, no? And I don't think any one of those is less vital or real as the Bendito that's sitting here. As to, you know, what its future is, in our first book, there's a line where we say, the unintended possibilities of technology that dictate the future. I think it's the unintended consequences of technology that will dictate our future selves. the really groundbreaking, seismic aspects about the future are precisely the ones that we can't predict. What the book, The Extreme Self, tries to do is track whether the concept of individuality is still the same thing as it was 5 years ago. In some ways it is. I think there's an essential idea of the self that is timeless. You know, there's some aspect of you and me that I don't think is fundamentally different to us 100 years ago, 500 years ago. At the same time, I think the possibilities of who else we can be whilst we are also being ourselves, that has multiplied, no? And that keeps inventing and reinventing itself. I mean, the other way to think about fiction would be, from time immemorial, we are born into narratives. If we're lucky, we take the agency to produce narratives. The really dispossessed in the world are those who are born into narratives that they have never chosen and are not able to exit. And so I think of the future of the self as a story-making machine. And I think the fact that we don't really know what we're going to be like in 5 years' time is what makes it so vital and kind of electric. I think if we were able to tell, it would be extremely boring. We will look back at this moment and we will keep doing that, and we will keep saying that, my God, how did things make so much sense back then? Because and we keep outdoing ourselves. That's what's amazing, you know. And it goes back to what you were saying about neuroplasticity. I think there is, you know, as often some experts would say, no, there's a limit. We're going to reach some frontier. I don't agree with that. No, I think in that sense there are kind of infinite possibilities to what the brain can adapt to. That's where I'm optimistic.
Yeah, I mean, the future is completely unpredictable. And what a time to, you know, for people like ourselves who are interested in culture, what a time to be alive. I'm so glad to be alive. I count my lucky stars every day. You know, there are some horrifying things about it, but it's endlessly fascinating. And yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for coming and talking to me. It's been an absolute pleasure. I could have talked to you for, you know, a lot longer, but we have homes to go to and lives to live. So thank you very much.
So what, you can't sleep?
I can sleep. I just don't want to. I can sleep.